The woman who rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882 did so on a horse that looked like it had seen more hard miles than the rider, and that was saying something considerable, because the rider looked like she had survived something that most people did not. Her name was Opal Reed, though nobody in Caldwell knew that yet. They knew only what they could see from the weathered boardwalks and the dusty windows of the Silver Bell Saloon and the dry goods store, and the small post office that doubled as the land office on alternating Thursdays. What they could see was a woman somewhere in her mid-20s, sitting straight in the saddle with the particular pride of someone who has earned it the hard way. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had once been brown and was now the color of the road itself. Her clothes were trail-worn but clean, which told a different story than most drifters told. And across the left side of her jaw, cutting from just below her ear to the corner of her mouth, there was a scar. Pale and smooth against her sun-bronzed skin, old enough to have settled, permanent enough to be a part of her face rather than an interruption of it, people looked. People in small frontier towns always looked at strangers, and they especially looked at strangers who carried visible evidence of a hard life. But nobody asked. That was the unwritten law of the West in those years. A person's past was their own property, the same as their horse and their sidearm, and you did not reach for another person's property without an invitation. Nobody asked, that is, until Homer Graves did, but that came later. First, Opal had to water her horse and find herself a meal and figure out whether Caldwell, Kansas was the kind of town a person could stay in for a while without the past catching up. She tied her mare, a strawberry roan she called Cress, at the hitching post outside the Silver Bell. She was not there for whiskey, she rarely was these days, but the saloon was also where a traveler could get a plate of food and sometimes hear the local talk, which was often more useful than anything printed in a newspaper. She pushed through the bat-wing doors and stood for a moment letting her eyes adjust from the bright Kansas morning to the dim interior. The Silver Bell was a respectable establishment by frontier standards, which meant the bar top was wiped down at least twice a day. The games in the back corner were not obviously rigged, and the women who worked there were not required to do anything they had not agreed to in advance, which was not a standard that every establishment in the territory bothered to maintain. There were perhaps a dozen men inside, a few at the bar nursing morning whiskeys, a couple at tables nursing coffee, and one man in the back corner who appeared to be doing something complicated with a set of papers spread across the table in front of him, and a cup of coffee at his elbow that was clearly being ignored. Opal took a seat at the bar. The barkeep, a broad man with impressive mustaches and the general temperament of a man who had heard everything and was surprised by nothing, set a tin mug of coffee in front of her without being asked. "Kitchen's got eggs and salt pork this morning," he said. "That'll do," Opal said. Her voice was low and clear, with a trace of something southern in it that had been mostly worn away by years of moving. The barkeep went to shout the order through the back, and Opal wrapped both hands around the mug and let the warmth work into her palms, because even in April the mornings came in cold on the Kansas plain, and she had been riding since before full light. She drank her coffee and watched the room in the mirror behind the bar with the careful attention of someone who had learned to keep track of exits and faces simultaneously. It was a habit she had not chosen so much as grown, the way a tree grows around a fence post, shaped by something external until the shape becomes permanent. The man in the back corner with the papers eventually stood up, gathered everything into a leather satchel, and crossed to the bar. He set the satchel on the bar top and signaled for a refill on his coffee, and only then did Opal get a clear look at him. He was tall, a few years older than her, perhaps 28 or 29, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than from posturing. His face was open and honest in a way that was somehow both reassuring and startling, because open and honest faces were not the most common thing in the world. His hair was dark brown and needed a cut. He had a marshal's badge on his coat, which he wore the way some men wore their hats, like it was simply part of him, rather than something he had decided to put on for the day. He noticed her noticing him, and he nodded the way men in the West nodded at strangers, which was polite and non-committal and communicated nothing beyond basic acknowledgement of shared humanity. Opal nodded back and returned her attention to her coffee. The barkeep brought her eggs and salt pork on a tin plate, and she ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had skipped meals enough times to understand that food deserved attention when it was available. She was nearly finished when the man with the badge said, without particular preamble, "You just ride in." "This morning," Opal said. "Long ride, long enough." She kept her eyes on her plate, which was a signal any sensible man would read correctly. This particular man seemed to read it and set it aside. "You looking for work?" he asked. "Or just passing through?" She looked at him, then measuring. "Depends on what's available," she said. "I'm Homer Graves," he said. "I'm the deputy marshal here, not trying to pry, just we get a lot of folks passing through. Some of them are looking for trouble and some of them are looking to get away from it. I like to know which is which when I can." "Opal Reed," she said. "I'm looking to get away from it." Something in his face shifted, not into suspicion but into something quieter than that. Something closer to understanding. "Most folks who come through here are," he said. He picked up his coffee and his satchel. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over run by a woman named Clara Hutchins. Clean rooms, fair price, she doesn't ask questions." "Thank you," Opal said. He nodded and headed for the door, and that was the first time they spoke. It was not, however, the first time he asked about the scar. That came later. He asked about the scar in a way, and at a moment that changed everything, though neither of them knew that yet. Opal found Clara Hutchins's boarding house without difficulty. Clara herself was a woman of perhaps 50, small and efficient, with iron-gray hair and the brisk manner of someone who had been running things alone for a long time and had gotten very good at it. She showed Opal a room on the 2nd floor with a narrow window that looked out over the back garden, a bed with a real mattress and clean linens, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a small iron stove that could be lit in the evenings if the night stayed cold. $2 a week, Clara said. That includes breakfast and supper. You wash your own clothes or you pay Mrs. Alvarez on the corner 2 bits for the whole batch. I don't allow men in the rooms after dark, and I don't allow whiskey on the premises. I do allow cats because they keep the mice down, and if you have a problem with my cat Edgar, you'll need to find other accommodation." "I have no problem with cats," Opal said. "Good. Then we'll get along fine." Clara paused at the door, and for a moment Opal thought she was going to say something about the scar, because they often did at this point in the conversation, or they did not say something but looked pointedly, which was in some ways worse. Clara did neither. She simply said, "Supper is at 6. Don't be late because I don't hold plates." Opal unpacked her things, which did not take long because she did not have many of them. A change of clothes, a small leather roll of sewing implements, a book with a broken spine that she had been carrying for 2 years, a daguerreotype in a small case that she opened and looked at for a moment before setting face down on the washstand, a coin purse that was not as heavy as she would have liked, and a small folding knife that she slipped under the mattress with the practiced motion of someone who did it every night and did not think of it as a remarkable thing to do. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the back garden, which had been recently turned and showed the dark promise of a kitchen garden just getting started. The sky beyond it was that particular Kansas blue that she had been looking at for 3 days of riding and still did not entirely believe. She had come from Missouri, which had its own sky, and before that from Tennessee, which had yet another. She had been moving west for 4 years, not running exactly, or at least not only running but also looking. She was not entirely sure what she was looking for. She thought it might be something as simple as a place where nobody already knew her name or her story, where she could be Opal Reed without the weight of everything that name had collected along the way. Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, might have been that place. It was a cattle town, positioned on the Kisham Trail, which meant that through the summer it would be loud and busy and full of cowboys coming up from Texas with the trail herds. But in April it was still quiet enough to hear yourself think, and that was what she needed. She unpacked her sewing kit and spent the afternoon mending a tear in her second shirt while Edgar the cat, an enormous orange tabby of sovereign dignity, came and investigated her ankles and then settled on the foot of her bed as if he had always intended to. She ate supper with the other boarders. A traveling dry goods salesman named Mr. Prentice who talked too much about the railroad, a young schoolteacher named Miss Dolores Vega who had come from Santa Fe and was starting the new term at the Caldwell school in the fall, and a quiet older man named Walt who worked at the grain elevator and said nothing, but ate with great concentration and appreciation. Clara sat at the head of the table and kept the conversation moving with the skill of a woman who had been hosting strangers at her table for many years. Nobody mentioned the scar. Opal went to bed early and slept without dreaming, which was a mercy. The next morning she went looking for work, because the coin purse would not sustain itself indefinitely, and she was not a person who believed in waiting for things to come to her when she could go and find them herself. She found it sooner than she expected, and in a more unlikely place. The newspaper office was a small building next to the post office, its front window painted with the words Caldwell Chronicle, R-B-A-L-L-A-R-D, proprietor. Opal pushed open the door mostly out of curiosity. She had always liked the smell of printer's ink, and found herself in a room full of type cases and a hand press and loose paper and a red-faced man in his 50s who was wrestling with what appeared to be a jammed roller and losing. "Need a hand," Opal said. The man looked up. "You know anything about a Washington hand press?" "Some," Opal said, which was an understatement. She had worked in a print shop in Memphis for 11 months, which was the longest she had stayed anywhere in the past 4 years, until she had needed to leave Memphis the same way she had needed to leave other places, quickly and without ceremony. She crossed to the press and examined the roller situation and found the problem, which was a piece of packing that had slipped and was catching. She worked it loose with her fingers and resituated it and ran the roller through once slowly, and it moved the way it was supposed to. The man stared at her. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Memphis," she said. "Can you set type?" "I can." "Can you write?" She met his eyes. "Better than most," she said, which was also an understatement. His name was Robert Ballard, and he had been running the Chronicle alone for 3 years since his compositor had left for the silver fields in Colorado and had not returned, which Robert Ballard considered a personal betrayal of a significant order. He hired Opal on the spot at $1.50 a week plus the understanding that if anything she wrote for the paper turned out to be good, he would pay her separately for the writing at the same rate he paid anyone else, which was not lavish but was honest. She started work the following morning. Within a week, she had settled into a routine that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of something sustainable. She worked at the Chronicle from early morning until the afternoon. She walked back to the boarding house for supper with Clara and the other boarders, who were slowly becoming familiar in the way that shared meals made people familiar. She spent her evenings reading or, increasingly, writing things of her own in a journal that she kept in the locked drawer of the washstand. She saw Homer Graves most days, because Caldwell was small enough that most people saw most other people most days, and also because the Deputy Marshal's office was on the same street as the Chronicle, and he was a man who moved through his town on foot rather than on horseback, unless there was a reason to be mounted. He nodded to her when they passed. She nodded back. They exchanged the brief pleasantries of neighbors, the weather, the state of the street, whether the supply wagon had come in from Wichita. He was, she noticed, very good at his job, not in the flashy way of some lawmen who seemed to feel that authority required performance. He was good at it in the quiet way, knowing everybody's name, knowing which situations required a word and which required something firmer, being present in a way that was reassuring rather than oppressive. The cowboys who came through on their way to the cattle pens respected him because he was fair, and the townspeople trusted him because he was consistent, and those two things together were rarer than they should have been. She also noticed, with the part of herself that she had learned to be very careful about, that he was kind. Not soft. There was nothing soft about Homer Graves, but genuinely, fundamentally kind, in the way that some people simply were, as a fact of their nature rather than a choice they had made. She was careful about noticing this. She had learned to be careful about noticing things like that. The moment that changed everything came on a Saturday afternoon in early May, 3 weeks after Opal had arrived in Caldwell. She had been sitting on the bench outside the Chronicle, using the last of the good afternoon light to review a proof, when Homer came by and stopped. He stopped not in the deliberate way of someone who had planned to stop, but in the incidental way of someone who had been walking and simply found that his feet had made a different decision. "You're good at that," he said, nodding at the proof sheet. "At reading," she said. "At concentrating," he said. "Most people, you walk by them, they look up. You didn't look up." "I knew it was you," she said, and then felt the slight warmth that came with having said something inadvertently revealing. She kept her eyes on the proof. "Your boots make a particular sound on the boards." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him standing there, not in an uncomfortable way, just in the way that a solid presence can be felt even without looking at it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked up then. His expression was the same open, honest thing it always was. No calculation in it, no prurience, just a question that wanted asking. "You can ask," she said, which was not the same as saying she would answer. He sat down on the other end of the bench, not close, just companionable. He turned his hat in his hands the way men did when they were choosing their words carefully. "The scar," he said quietly, not looking at her but not looking away either, keeping his eyes on the middle distance. "I'm not asking out of nosiness. I'm asking because in 3 weeks I haven't seen you flinch from anything. The noise when the cattle come through, the rough talk from the cowboys, 2 separate men who gave you trouble outside the saloon, and that you handled better than most men I know would have. But every now and then, when something startles you, your hand goes to your jaw. And I've been wondering about the story behind that." The silence sat between them, and it was not an empty silence. It was a silence with weight to it. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes steadily, without pressure. "That's the most thoughtful thing anyone has said to me about it," she said finally. "I meant it to be," he said. She folded the proof sheet carefully and set it on the bench beside her. She looked at her hands. Then she began to speak quietly in the tone of someone reading from a document they have read many times before and know by heart. "I was in Tennessee," she said. "I was 21. I was married." She paused. "He was not a good man. I didn't know that when I married him, or I didn't let myself know it, which comes to the same thing. The scar is from the night I finally left. He had a ring on the hand he used, and rings leave marks." She touched the scar then lightly with 2 fingers. "I walked 14 miles in the dark to my sister's house, and she put me on a train in the morning, and I haven't been back." Homer said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Your sister," he said, "is she still there?" "She died 2 years ago," Opal said. "Fever. She was 24. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the plainest, most uncomplicated expression of genuine sorrow she had heard in a long time. Not pity, not the uncomfortable sympathy of someone who does not know what to do with another person's pain, just sorrow offered simply. "Thank you," she said. "The man," Homer said after another pause, he's still in Tennessee," she said. "As far as I know, I'm divorced legally. It took nearly a year and cost money I didn't have, but I made it happen." She said this with a quiet fierceness that was not anger exactly, more like the satisfaction of having done something difficult and necessary. "I'm not running from the law. I'm not running from him anymore either. I've just gotten into the habit of moving." "Until now," he said. She looked at him, surprised by the question. "You seem like someone who might be considering stopping," he said. "For a while." She thought about the room with the window overlooking the garden, about Edgar's warm weight on the foot of the bed, about the smell of printer's ink in the morning and the way Dollar's Vega laughed at supper and the particular blue of the Kansas sky. Maybe, she said, for a while. He stood, settled his hat back on his head. He looked at her the way you look at something you have been trying to understand and have just gotten slightly clearer. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I know that wasn't nothing." "No," she said, "it wasn't nothing." He walked on down the street in the late afternoon light, and Opal sat for a while longer on the bench, feeling something she had not felt in a long time. Not safety exactly. She was too experienced to mistake a conversation for safety. Something subtler. The feeling of having been seen accurately and not found wanting. Of having been asked with care and having answered honestly and having the answer received well. She picked up the proof sheet and went back to work. The cattle season began properly in mid-May, when the first of the trail herds started arriving from Texas, and Caldwell transformed from a quiet town into something considerably louder and more complicated. The streets filled with cowboys who had been on the trail for months and were looking for every variety of recreation that money could purchase. The Silver Bell and the two other saloons ran around the clock. The cattle pens south of town were busy from before dawn. Homer and Marshal Dan Holt, his superior, spent considerably longer hours doing considerably more difficult work. Opal found the cattle season interesting from a journalistic perspective. She wrote a piece for the Chronicle about the economics of the cattle trade, interviewing several of the trail bosses who were willing to talk and synthesizing their accounts into something that Robert Ballard said was the best thing the paper had published in 2 years. She wrote another piece about the Mexican and black cowboys who made up significant portions of the trail crews and whose skills and contributions were rarely acknowledged in the accounts that most papers printed. And this one she had to argue for, because Robert Ballard was uncertain whether it was appropriate. "These men drive the cattle the same as anyone else," she told him, with a calm directness that left him nodding. "Some of them are the best ropers and riders on the trail, and their trail bosses will tell you so if you ask. If the paper is going to write about the cattle trade, it should write about it honestly." He ran the piece. Several people complained. Several others, including, she discovered later, Homer Graves, said privately that it was the most honest thing the paper had run about the trade. It was during the cattle season that she and Homer began to spend real time together, in the casual way that people in small towns could fall into easy companionship without anyone making a particular decision about it. It started with the practical. The Silver Bell was also where information moved, and Opal needed information for her articles, and Homer was in the Silver Bell more often during cattle season, because that was where things that needed managing tended to happen. They fell into the habit of sitting at the same table sometimes, over coffee in the morning before things got loud, and talking. She discovered that he was from Illinois originally, from a farm outside Springfield, and that he had come west 6 years ago at the age of 22 looking for something he could not precisely articulate, and had found instead a lawman's badge in a Kansas cattle town, which was not what he had been looking for but had turned out to suit him. He had a mother still living in Illinois who wrote him letters regularly. He had a younger brother who was a doctor in St. Louis. He had read more books than his profession might have suggested and had opinions about them. He discovered that she wrote not only for the paper but in her own private capacity, and he asked about that with the same careful directness he had used to ask about the scar, in a way that indicated he was genuinely curious rather than making conversation. "Fiction?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "Mostly just writing about what I've seen, the places I've been through, the people." She hesitated. "I'd like to make a book of it someday." "You should," he said, without qualification or doubt. The summer moved forward, hot and busy and full of color. Opal found that Caldwell was, after all, the kind of place she had been looking for. She found this out slowly, the way you find out things that matter, not in a single moment of recognition, but in the accumulation of small evidence. The way Clara noticed when she was tired and left a pot of tea outside her door. The way Dolores Vega had become a genuine friend, someone she could talk to in the evenings about books, and about the particular challenges of being a woman trying to make something of herself in a world that had specific ideas about what women should be making. The way the work at the Chronicle felt meaningful, because it was honest work that mattered to the community she was becoming part of. And the way Homer Graves had become part of the texture of her days, without either of them making a declaration about it. She thought about this sometimes with caution. She had not been cautious enough before, with Thomas Reed, who had been charming and handsome, and had shown her exactly what he wanted her to see until she was already married, and it was too late to unsee anything. She did not believe that Homer was like Thomas. Everything she had observed over 3 months suggested the opposite, but she had believed things before and been wrong, and that knowledge lived in the scar along her jaw as surely as it lived in her memory. She was thinking about this on a particular evening in late June when Homer knocked on the door of the Chronicle just as she was finishing up and asked if she wanted to walk over to the restaurant on 2nd Street for supper, because Mrs. Tompkins was making her pie on Fridays, and it was the best pie in southern Kansas, and he thought she might like it. It was, she recognized, a date, though he had not used that word. He had extended an invitation in the way of a man who was not entirely sure of his welcome and was being careful about it, which she found she appreciated more than she could easily explain. "Yes," she said, "I would like pie." They walked to the restaurant in the warm evening, the town quieter than usual because most of the cowboys had moved on with the last herd of the week, and the weekend rush had not yet built. Mrs. Tompkins seated them at a table by the window and brought them chicken and dumplings, and eventually, a piece of peach pie each that was, in fact, the best pie Opal had tasted in a considerable time. They talked for 2 hours. About books and about the town, and about the changes coming with the railroad expansion, and about what the prairie looked like in winter, which Homer described with the particular precision of someone who had spent years watching the same landscape in all its variations. He told her about a blizzard in 1880 that had killed cattle for 100 miles and how the town had pulled together in the aftermath, neighbor helping neighbor in the way that disasters sometimes revealed people's best qualities rather than their worst. "Is that why you stayed?" she asked. "After the blizzard." He considered this. "I think so. I've been thinking about moving on, maybe going back east, but watching the way people came through that, it seemed like the kind of place worth staying in." She looked at him across the table, in the candlelight that was the only illumination in the restaurant at this hour, and she thought that he was one of the most uncomplicated people she had ever met, in the sense that what you saw was what was there. It was a quality she had not known to value until she had experienced its absence. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask," he said, giving her words back to her with a small smile that acknowledged he was doing so deliberately. "When you stopped and asked about the scar," she said, "you said you'd noticed how I handled myself, how I handled the men who gave me trouble. What did you think of that?" He didn't rush to answer. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, which she had noticed was what he did when he was thinking carefully. "I thought it was impressive," he said, "and I thought it was sad. Not the capability isn't sad. The fact that you needed to develop it, that a woman traveling alone has to be able to handle herself like that just to move through the world." He paused. "That's not how things ought to be." "No," she said. "It isn't." She looked at him. "But knowing that something isn't how it ought to be and knowing what to do about it are different problems." "They are," he agreed. "I can only control what I control, which is this town on most days." "You do a good job of it," she said. He smiled, and it was the real smile, the one she had learned to distinguish from the polite professional one. "Thank you, Opal." It was the first time he had used her name with that particular warmth in it, and she felt it somewhere below the level of thought. They walked back through the summer night, slowly, neither of them in a hurry. At the door of the boarding house he stopped and looked at her, and there was a question in his eyes that he did not put into words, which she appreciated because it meant the question was still hers to answer on her own time. "Good night, Homer," she said. "Good night," he said. He held her gaze for just a moment longer. "Thank you for coming to supper with me." "Thank you for the invitation," she said, and went inside. She sat on her bed for a long time in the dark with Edgar warm against her side, and she thought about what it meant to trust someone again, and whether she was capable of it, and whether Homer Graves was someone worth the risk of trying. She did not reach a conclusion that night. But she noticed that, for the first time in a long time, the question felt like something she wanted to examine rather than something she wanted to run from. July brought the heat and the last of the big herds of the season, and with them came a complication that Opal had not anticipated. His name was Billy Cresswell, and he was a cowboy from Texas who had ridden the trail 3 times and apparently had a memory for faces. He came into the Chronicle one morning while Opal was setting type and stood in the doorway looking at her with the expression of a man who is trying to place something. "I know you," he said. "I don't believe we've met," she said, without turning around because she had heard this before and it almost never meant anything good. "Memphis," he said. "About 3 years back. You were working in Connolly's print shop. Your name was Reed then." She turned around then because there was no point in not. "My name is still Reed," she said. "What can I do for you?" He was a young man, perhaps 25, with an honest sunburned face and no particular malice in his eyes. He appeared, now that she was looking at him, to simply be a man who had recognized someone and thought it worth mentioning. "Nothing," he said. "Just I thought I recognized you. Sorry to interrupt." He started to go, then turned back. "You left Memphis pretty sudden. There was some talk about, it wasn't my business, but I hope things are better now." She looked at him steadily. "They are," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and left, and she stood for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the type case, feeling the small cold rush that accompanied any reminder that the past was not always as distant as she would have liked. Memphis had been. There had been a man in Memphis who had known Thomas Reed, who had found Opal and told her that Thomas was looking for her, even though they were legally divorced, even though she had done nothing illegal. Thomas had been the kind of man who did not accept that things were over when they were actually over. She had left Memphis because of that. She had spent the following year moving quickly, and then more slowly, and had gradually let herself believe that enough distance and time had accumulated to make her safe. She thought, for the first time in months, that she should perhaps be worried. That evening she found Homer at the marshal's office, which was where he usually was at the end of the day doing the paperwork that the job required and that he did not particularly enjoy. "Can I talk to you?" she said from the doorway. He looked up immediately, reading something in her face, and gestured her in. She sat down in the chair across from his desk and told him about Memphis and about Thomas Reed, and about the man who had told her she was being looked for. She had not planned to tell him, but she found that once she had started she kept going, because he listened with the quality of attention that made telling the truth feel like the only reasonable option. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Has he been looking for you since Memphis?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know if Billy Cresswell will tell anyone he saw me. Probably not. He seemed harmless enough. But you want to be prepared," Homer said. "Yes." "What does Thomas Reed look like?" She described him. Homer wrote it down, not on an official form, just in the small notebook he carried. He wrote it down carefully as if it mattered, which it did. "I'm going to send some wires," he said. "Just checking, see if there's anything of record." He looked at her. "And Opal, you're not doing anything wrong. You have every right to be here. If he shows up, the law is on your side." "The law doesn't always move as fast as a man on horseback," she said. "No," he acknowledged. "It doesn't, but I do." She looked at him across the desk in the lamplit office, with the sounds of the summer evening coming in through the open window, and something she had been holding carefully, the way you hold something fragile, shifted and settled. "You're a good man, Homer Graves," she said. He did not dismiss this or deflect it. He simply said, "I'm trying to be." She went back to the boarding house feeling steadier than she had felt all day. The wires Homer sent came back over the following days. Thomas Reed had not been in any legal trouble in Tennessee, which was not surprising. Men like Thomas Reed rarely were. But there was also nothing to indicate he had left Tennessee, no warrants in his name, no reports of him elsewhere. Homer shared this with Opal carefully, explaining what it meant and what it did not mean. "It's not a guarantee," he said, "but it's something." "It is," she said. They had fallen by July into something that both of them understood to be more than friendship without either of them having said so explicitly. They ate supper together at Mrs. Tompkins' restaurant on Fridays. They sat together sometimes on the bench outside the Chronicle in the late afternoons when the work was done, and the evening had not yet fully begun. He brought her books from his own shelf, which was more extensive than she would have predicted, and they discussed them with the easy argument of people who are genuinely interested in each other's thinking. He did not touch her, except incidentally. A hand steadied against her elbow when she stepped off a high boardwalk, the brush of fingers when she handed him a cup of coffee. He was, she recognized, a man who understood that some things could not be rushed, and more than that she specifically was someone who needed to arrive at things in her own time. He was patient in a way that was not passive. He was clearly present, clearly interested, but he did not push. She thought about this a great deal. She thought about it one evening when they were sitting on the bench in front of the Chronicle in the cooling air of a July night, and he had been reading aloud to her from a collection of poems he had recently acquired, because she had mentioned once that she liked being read to, and he had remembered. He was reading a Whitman poem, his voice low and unhurried in the blue evening, and she was looking at the first stars coming out over the Kansas plain, and she thought, "This is the kind of life I would choose if I were allowed to choose. And then, I am allowed to choose. That is the whole point." She turned to look at him. He was still reading, his head bent slightly over the book, his profile clear against the fading sky. She looked at the honest line of his jaw and the way his hair fell across his forehead and the comfortable sureness of the way he held himself, as if he knew where he was in the world and was satisfied with it. "Homer," she said. He looked up. She reached across and took his hand, which was resting on the bench between them. She turned it over in both of hers and held it, feeling the warmth and the roughness of it, the particular solidity of another person's hand. He did not move. He sat very still, the way a man sits when something very important is happening and he does not want to disturb it. "I'm not good at this," she said. "I used to think I was, and then I found out I wasn't, and now I'm starting from a different place." "Okay," he said, quietly. "I'm telling you that because I want to try anyway," she said. "With you, if you want to." He turned his hand over and held hers properly, warm and steady, and he looked at her with those open, honest eyes and said, "I want to." "Good," she said. They sat in the evening air holding hands until the stars were properly out, and it was simple and it was right, and it was, she thought, the first uncomplicated good thing she had allowed herself in years. August in Caldwell was Opal's favorite month, which surprised her, because it was also the hottest and the busiest. But there was something about the full height of summer, the way the light slanted golden and enormous across the plain in the late afternoons, the smell of the dry grass and the dust, the particular energy of a town that was fully alive, that she had come to love. She and Homer were, by August, being openly courted as a couple in the small social vocabulary of Caldwell, which meant that people acknowledged their status without comment and included them together in invitations, and made various small accommodations of the kind that communities make for two people who have declared themselves to each other. Clara Hutchins, who was not a sentimental woman, told Opal at breakfast one morning that Homer Graves was one of the solid ones, which Opal understood to be as strong a commendation as Clara was likely to offer. Dolores Vega, who was more demonstrative, simply hugged Opal one evening and said, "I'm so glad you stopped here." "So am I," Opal said, and meant it. She and Homer were learning each other with the thoroughness and attention that comes from both people being adults who have already made mistakes and are paying careful attention this time. He told her about the things he was afraid of, which turned out to include failure of a specific kind, the failure to be useful, to be present, to do what was needed. She recognized this as the fear of a person who had built their sense of self around their reliability, and she understood it. And she told him that she had observed him be reliable in small things and large ones over 4 months, and had not yet found an exception. He told her that the thing he most regretted was that he had not gone home to Illinois when his father died 3 years ago, because he had been in the middle of a difficult situation in the town, and had decided he was needed here more than he was needed there. He was still not sure he had made the right call, and it sat in him like a stone. She thought about what to say for a moment, and then said, "The fact that it still sits in you is evidence that you're not the kind of man who makes that choice lightly. That matters." He looked at her with something in his eyes that was very deep. "You're very good at knowing what needs to be said," he told her. "I'm a writer," she said. "Words are what I have." "You have more than words," he said, "though the words are considerable." She laughed, and he looked pleased in the way that people look pleased when they have made someone they love laugh. They said they loved each other for the first time on an evening in mid-August, standing at the edge of town where the boardwalk ran out and the prairie began, watching a sunset that was the kind of thing that seemed designed to make a person feel small and astonished in equal measure. The sky was orange and crimson and a shade of pink that had no proper name, spread from horizon to horizon without interruption, and the grass was gold, and the air smelled of dry earth and distant rain. He said it first, which surprised her because she had thought she would need to say it first to give him permission. But he said it simply, looking at the sky, not making a production of it, as naturally as if he were noting the weather. "I love you, Opal." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, steady and clear. "I love you," she said back, and the words felt like something she had been carrying a long time and was only now setting down. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood at the edge of the prairie in the great burning sunset and let the moment exist without qualification. The complication she had been fearing arrived in the first week of September. She was in the Chronicle, working alone because Robert Ballard had gone to Wichita for the day, when the door opened and she looked up and her body knew before her mind did. The particular stillness that came over her, the way her hand stopped moving, it was a physical response, older than thought. Thomas Reed had not changed much in 4 years. He was still the handsome man she had married at 19, with the dark hair and the broad shoulders and the smile that did not reach the eyes unless the eyes wanted it to. He was wearing trail clothes, which meant he had ridden a long way. He was standing in the doorway of her place of work looking at her with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he believed he was being reasonable. "Opal," he said, "you're a hard woman to find." "I intended to be," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I just want to talk," he said. "There is nothing to talk about. We are divorced, Thomas, legally. The papers are filed in Memphis and I have copies." "That's not why I came." He took a step into the room. "I came because I've changed, Opal. I know what you think of me. I know I gave you reason to think it, but a man can change." "Please leave," she said. He took another step. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to. I asked you to leave," she said. He stopped and the mask slipped slightly, the way it always did when he encountered resistance he had not anticipated. She had learned to watch for that slip years ago, because what was underneath it was never better than the mask. She did not move toward the door. She did not have to. Homer appeared in the doorway behind Thomas, and he did not announce himself or make a dramatic entrance. He simply stood there, and his presence was such that Thomas turned around instinctively, the way people turn when they sense something significant behind them. Homer was in uniform, his badge catching the morning light, and he was carrying no particular expression at all, which was somehow more serious than if he had been carrying an obvious one. "Sir," Homer said, in the quiet voice he used for situations that required care, I'm going to need to ask you to step outside. I'm just having a conversation with my former wife, Homer said. Yes, I know who you are, Mr. Reed. I've been expecting you. He held the door open. Outside, please. Thomas went outside because the alternative was a confrontation with a deputy marshal that would not have gone well for him. Homer followed him out and Opal went to the window and watched, because she had learned long ago that knowing what was happening was better than not knowing. She could not hear what Homer said, but she could see his posture and Thomas's, and she could see the moment Thomas understood that this particular situation was not going to resolve in his favor. Homer spoke for perhaps 4 minutes, calmly, steadily, and Thomas's shoulders went from aggressive to defensive to simply tired. At the end, Homer handed him something. She would learn later it was a folded paper, a formal notice that Thomas Reed was not to approach Opal Reed or her place of work, which Homer had prepared 2 days ago when the wires had come back indicating that a man matching Thomas's description had left Tennessee 6 weeks earlier. He had been quietly watching for Thomas's arrival since then. Thomas took the paper. He looked at it. He looked back at the window, and Opal held his gaze from behind the glass, steady and unbending, and something in his expression shifted into something that looked almost like recognition. The recognition of someone who has finally understood that the thing they were looking for is genuinely gone. He put the paper in his coat and walked to his horse at the hitching post and rode north out of Caldwell, and she never saw him again. Homer came back inside. He looked at her with the careful, steady attention he always gave her. He's going to leave town, he said. He knows if he doesn't, the legal situation becomes much more difficult for him. He also knows. He paused. I told him some things about the kind of support you have here, in case knowing them was useful. What kind of things? She said. That you're not alone, Homer said simply. She looked at him across the print room in the smell of ink and paper in the September morning light. She felt the scar along her jaw, and she felt the 4 years of moving and the 14 miles in the dark, and the train station, and the grief of her sister, and all of it. The whole long weight of the story. And she felt it from the other side now, from the place where it was history rather than ongoing. She crossed the room and she put her arms around Homer Graves and held on, and he held on back, steadily and without needing her to explain anything. Thank you, she said against his shoulder. You don't have to thank me, he said. I meant what I said. You're not alone. She pulled back enough to look at him. His face was the same as it always was, open and honest and kind and entirely itself. She thought, I am not 19 years old and I am not reading what I want to see. I am 25 years old and I have seen a great deal and I know the difference. No, she said, I'm not. The autumn came in over the Kansas plain like a slow golden tide, cooling the air and turning the grass and pulling the light lower in the sky. The cattle season wound down as the last of the herds moved through, and Caldwell shifted into its quieter winter register. The Chronicle put out its fall edition with a piece by Opal about the year in the cattle trade that was the most widely read thing the paper had published in recent memory. Robert Ballard received complimentary letters from as far as Wichita and once, surprisingly, from Kansas City. Opal was writing more of her own work in the evenings, the journal filling and a new one starting. She had told Homer about the book she wanted to make of her travels and her observations, and he had asked to read some of it, and when she let him, he had read it with the concentrated attention he gave everything that mattered, and when he handed it back he said, "This needs to be published," with the simple conviction of a man who knows what he is talking about. "Maybe someday," she said. "Sooner than someday," he said. They had been talking about the future more generally, in the tentative and then increasingly less tentative way that two people talk when they have started to see the future as something they might navigate together. It was not a single conversation but many conversations, threaded through the autumn over coffee in the mornings, over supper on Friday evenings, on walks along the edge of town in the cooling air where the sky stretched enormous overhead. Homer proposed to her on a Sunday afternoon in October, sitting on the front porch of the boarding house. He had asked Clara's permission to use the porch, which Clara had granted with the dry observation that it was about time, with the elm tree in the front garden going gold around them, and the sound of the town quiet in the Sunday afternoon way. He did not have a ring yet. He told her this directly. I don't have a ring yet because I didn't want to choose it without you, because the choosing of it should be yours as much as mine. He held her hand in both of his. But I want to ask now, because I've been wanting to ask for a while, and I think waiting any longer is just cowardice. She looked at him. She thought about the first morning she had ridden into Caldwell, trailing 4 years of roads behind her, not knowing what she was looking for. She thought about the bench outside the Chronicle, and the conversation that had changed things. She thought about every small moment since the coffee, the books, the Friday suppers, the way he had stood in the doorway of the print room that September morning, the way he had said "You're not alone," the way he said her name. "Yes," she said. "Homer, yes." He exhaled in a way that told her he had been holding that breath for quite some time, and she laughed, and he laughed too, and he brought her hand up and held it against his cheek, which was the most tender gesture she had seen from him, and it made her heart turn over completely. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said back. They went to the jeweler together the following Saturday, and she chose a ring with a small opal set in silver. Homer's eyes had lit up when she reached for that one because, of course, and she had smiled and said yes. This one. And the jeweler sized it and had it ready by Wednesday, and she wore it home and felt its unfamiliar small weight on her hand and found, to her considerable surprise, and without any of the fear she had expected, that it felt right. They were married in December in the small church at the end of Front Street, with Clara Hutchins and Dolores Vega as witnesses, and Robert Ballard and Walt from the grain elevator, and Marshal Holt, and several other people from the town who had become, over the course of a year, the fabric of her daily life. The ceremony was short and honest, the way good ceremonies are. The minister asked the traditional words, and they answered them clearly, looking at each other rather than at the minister, which the minister later said was the most certain-looking pair of vows he had administered in 20 years. When Homer kissed her, properly, gently, with his hands on either side of her face in a way that was careful and warm, she felt the warmth of it from her jaw down through her bones, and the scar was there the same as always, and it was part of her face and part of her story, and it did not define the moment. The town had a small reception at the Silver Bell afterward, with music and dancing and better food than the saloon usually offered, because the barkeep had decided that Opal Reed, now Opal Graves, though she thought she might keep Reed for her writing, deserved a proper wedding supper, and had arranged accordingly. She danced with Homer in the cleared space in the middle of the room, in the candlelight, surrounded by the people of Caldwell, and she thought, I found it, the place I was looking for, and she held on. The winter was cold and clear and beautiful, the way Kansas winters could be when they chose to be. The plain went white and enormous, and the sky above it was a deep winter blue, and the town was quiet in the particular way of places that have settled into themselves for the cold season. They had moved into a house on the quieter street behind the main thoroughfare, a proper house, 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down, with a kitchen and a porch, and a bedroom with a window that looked east. So the morning light came in early, which Homer said was useful and Opal said was magnificent. She made curtains for the windows and he built shelves for the books, and Edgar the cat moved in with them because Clara said she had noticed his attachment, and besides she had 2 other cats, and Edgar, she suspected, had always preferred Opal's company. She kept working at the Chronicle through the winter, which Robert Ballard had not expected and was very glad of. She had become, over the course of the year, the paper's primary writer of anything requiring real thought, which left Ballard free to manage the business side, which was the part he actually enjoyed. She wrote about the winter preparations of the cattle industry, about the political situation with the railroads, about the establishment of a new school building, about a dispute over water rights on the South Range that she covered with a careful attention to the complexity of both sides that caused two parties who had been refusing to speak to each other to come to a negotiated agreement. Homer read everything she published and made observations about it afterward, and she had come to depend on his observations, because he saw things she had been too close to see. He had learned also to make suggestions rather than corrections, because she had made clear early on that her writing was her own, and she would take input with gratitude but would not take direction. He was fine with this. He was, she had learned, constitutionally capable of respecting a boundary once he understood where it was. In the spring, she sent a package of her essays and journals to a publishing house in New York that had expressed, through a contact of Robert Ballard's, some interest in accounts of the frontier. She sent them without much expectation, because she had been disappointed before in the small ways that people are disappointed when they want things and have learned to be realistic, but with the underlying certainty that the work was good. The spring also brought something else. She was not surprised. She had been watching for it, with the particular alertness of a woman who knows her own body, but she was moved by it in a way she had not anticipated, the depth of feeling that came with knowing. She told Homer on a morning in April, 1 year almost to the day after she had first ridden into Caldwell. She told him at the kitchen table over coffee, with Edgar sitting in the window and the sound of the first warm wind of the season outside. He stared at her for a moment, and she watched the information reach him and then settle, and his face did the thing that she loved, the thing where what was happening inside him simply showed on his face without filter. Truly. He said, truly, she said. He got up from his side of the table and came around to her side and knelt beside her chair and held her hands and looked at her like she was something astonishing, which she supposed she was, though not any more astonishing than he was or the world was in general. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "I feel well," she said. "A little tired, but well." "Good," he said. He pressed his forehead briefly against their joined hands. "Good." She looked at the top of his head and felt something enormous and quiet rise up in her chest. She thought of all the roads behind her and the woman who had ridden into this town a year ago with a scar and a story and the habit of moving. She thought of how she had never planned for this particular kind of permanence, had not let herself plan for it, and how planning for it had turned out not to be necessary because it had found her anyway. She put her hand on his hair gently. "Homer," she said. He looked up. "We're going to be all right," she said. "We are," he said. He turned his face into her palm and held it there for a moment, and she felt his warmth and his solidity and his certainty, which was not the certainty of someone who has never been uncertain, but the certainty of someone who has made a clear decision and kept it. The summer came again, the second summer, and it was the same as the first in its brightness and its heat and its color, but everything else was different because she was different, because this was no longer a town she had arrived in and stayed, but a town that was hers, and the difference between those two things was the whole world. She received a letter from the publishing house in New York in July. They wanted to publish her book, not the whole of what she had sent, but a selection, her essays about the cattle trail, her piece about the Mexican and black cowboys, her observations about the prairie seasons, and a longer narrative account of the experience of traveling alone as a woman through the frontier West, which the editor called unprecedented and necessary. She read the letter twice, standing in the front hallway of the Chronicle with the smell of ink around her, and then she put it in her pocket and went back to work. And at the end of the day she walked home through the late afternoon light and found Homer on the porch, having just come off his shift, his jacket off and his shirt sleeves rolled up, watching the street with the contented attention of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. She sat down beside him and handed him the letter without a word. He read it again, he looked at her. "Opal," he said. "I know," she said. "This is Opal, this is everything you deserved." "It's a start," she said. He put his arm around her, careful of the new roundness of her that was showing now, and she leaned into him and they sat on the porch in the late gold light of the Kansas summer evening, while the town moved around them in its ordinary, beautiful life. And she thought, this is the thing. This is the whole thing right here. Their son was born in November, delivered by the town's doctor with Clara Hutchins and Dolores Vega both present, because Opal had decided she wanted women around her for this. And Homer had understood and had sat in the kitchen for 4 hours with his hat in his hands and the terror and wonder of it plain on his face. The baby was healthy and loud about it, which the doctor said was a good sign, and he had Homer's dark hair and Opal's wide eyes, and his own very particular brand of insistence on making his presence known, which seemed right for a child of parents who had both found their way to this life by insisting on being present in it. They named him James Reed Graves Reed after Opal, because she was keeping her name in everything that mattered, and because the story of who she had been before Homer deserved a place in the name of who they were together. Homer held his son for the first time sitting in the chair by the bedroom window in the November afternoon light, and Opal watched him look at this small new person with the same open, unguarded face he had always had, and she thought, he is going to be a magnificent father. He looked up and caught her watching him and smiled the real smile, the one she had come to know as entirely hers. "Hello, James," he said to the baby, in the quiet voice he used for important things. "We've been waiting for you." The book came out in the spring, published under the name Opal Reed, which was the decision she had made, and the decision Homer had supported without qualification. The title was The Road West, which was what it was about the road, and what you found on it, and what you were when you reached the end of it, which was not the end of anything but a beginning of something else. Copies arrived in Caldwell by post, a box of them from the publisher, and Robert Ballard displayed one in the window of the Chronicle with tremendous pride, and the rest sold out of the bookshop on 2nd Street within a week. She received letters slowly at first, then with increasing frequency, from readers across the country, many of them women, many of them people who had their own experiences of roads traveled under difficult circumstances, who wrote to tell her that they had found something in her words that they had needed. She wrote back to all of them. It took time, but she felt it was necessary. The town had changed around them in the year since James's birth. Dolores Vega had married a cattle rancher named Samuel Park in the summer, which had surprised everyone but the people who had been paying attention, and she was teaching at the new school building and expecting her own child in the spring. Clara Hutchins had taken on a new boarder, a quiet woman named Agnes who was a photographer and who had set up a studio in one of the back rooms and was documenting the town with a methodical and loving attention. Homer was promoted to full marshal in the winter, after Dan Holt retired, which meant more responsibility and longer hours, but also the kind of work that suited Homer completely: the maintenance of a community's sense of safety and order, the daily practice of fairness. He took the promotion with his usual lack of ceremony, simply doing the job as he had always done it, but slightly more of it. James grew with the particular energy of a boy who had both parents' constitutions, Opal's watchfulness and Homer's steadiness, and something entirely his own on top of both. He was a good-natured child who observed the world with intense interest, which made Opal think of herself at that age, before the world had taught her to be careful about what she observed. She was glad that his early world was a safe one. She had worked hard in her particular way to make sure that it was. In the spring of the 2nd year after James's birth, Opal sat down at her desk in the small room at the front of the house that had become her writing room. Homer had set it up for her without being asked, simply moving the furniture one Sunday morning and announcing that she needed a room that was just for writing, and began a second book. This one was different. A story, fiction, a woman who traveled alone across the frontier. She was not sure if she was the woman in the story, and she was not sure it mattered. She wrote in the mornings when James was sleeping, and in the evenings when Homer sat with him. She wrote with the particular freedom of someone who has found that the worst has happened and been survived, and what comes after the worst can be written about without the fear of it happening. Homer came to stand in the doorway of the writing room sometimes, just to look at her, and she always knew when he was there the same way she had always known his footstep. And sometimes she kept writing, and sometimes she turned around and they looked at each other across the small room in the morning light, and no particular words were necessary. The second book came together more quickly than the first. By summer she had something she felt good about, and she sent it to the publisher in New York. And by fall they had agreed to publish it, and the business of it, the correspondence, the editing, the decisions was something she managed with the same practical directness she brought to everything. She was, in ways she had not expected, becoming someone who was known, in the small way that frontier writers became known in that era, read by particular readers who cared about the particular things she wrote about, who sent letters, who talked about her work in the way that work gets talked about when it has reached the people it was meant for. She did not take this lightly. She understood that she had a platform that many people like her had not been given, and she used it with the care it deserved, writing about the injustices she had witnessed, and the realities she had lived, and the communities that the newspapers usually talked past rather than about. On a winter evening in the third year of their marriage, with James asleep upstairs and Edgar on the hearth, and the snow quiet outside, Opal sat by the fire with her second book open in her lap, reading something she had written that she wanted to revisit. Homer sat across from her with the newspaper and the general air of a man who was satisfied with exactly where he was. "Homer," she said. He said, not looking up. "I'm happy," she said. He put the paper down. He looked at her steadily, reading her face the way he always had, with that full, open attention. "So am I," he said, and then, "I've been happy for a while. I wasn't sure when you'd notice." She threw a pillow at him, which he caught. He laughed and she laughed, and Edgar opened one eye and determined that none of this concerned him and closed it again. She thought about the woman who had ridden into Caldwell 3 years ago on a tired roan horse, carrying everything she owned, and a story she had told nobody. She thought about how that woman had planned to stay only as long as it felt safe, and to move on when the feeling changed, as it always had. She thought about the bench outside the Chronicle and the question nobody else had asked. She thought about how the answer she had given to that question had led, in the strange and indirect way that life led places, to exactly this: the fire and the book and the man across from her and the child asleep upstairs and the sound of the snow outside and all the days ahead. She looked at Homer. He was watching her with the same expression he'd worn the first time she had told him about the scar, not pity, not curiosity, just genuine care. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The day I rode in," she said. He nodded slowly. "I remember it." "I thought I'd be gone in a week," she said. "I know," he said. "I remember thinking that too. And then I watched you set up at the Chronicle and I thought maybe not." "You thought that the first week?" "I thought a lot of things the first week," he said with the dry honesty she loved. "Most of them were correct." "Humble as ever," she said. "I am a lawman," he said. "I'm paid to assess situations accurately." She smiled and looked back at her book and then set it down on the side table, because the book would be there tomorrow and Homer was here now. "Come sit with me," she said. He folded the newspaper and came and sat beside her on the settee, and she tucked against him in the warmth of the fire, and his arm came around her, steady as it always was, and she felt the solid reality of him and the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the house around them. "I want to take James to see Illinois when he's old enough to appreciate it," Homer said. "See my mother. She writes about him constantly and she's never met him." "Next summer," Opal said. "We can take the train." "She'll love you," he said. "She already does from the letters." "I hope so," Opal said. "She will," he said. "I wrote her about you before I'd even properly introduced myself, apparently." She wrote back and said it sounded like I'd better not let you leave town. Opal looked up at him. "You wrote to your mother about me before we'd had a proper conversation." "I told you I made assessments," he said. She laughed again, and he held her, and outside the snow came down soft and steady over the Kansas plain, covering everything in white silence, and the fire burned warm, and James slept peacefully upstairs with all his life ahead of him. And it was exactly as it should be, not perfect in the way of stories that pretend difficulty never existed, but complete in the way of things that have been earned and chosen, and held onto through the hardest parts. She put her hand to her jaw, a habit she had never quite lost, and felt the familiar ridge of the scar. It was there the same as it had always been, smooth and permanent. She did not think of Thomas when she touched it anymore, or at least not primarily. She thought of the night she had walked 14 miles in the dark to her sister's house, and the morning she had gotten on the train, and all the miles that came after, every difficult road, every town she had been through, every moment that had led her forward by necessity or by choice, until she had ridden into Caldwell on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882 on a tired roan horse, and a man had asked her the question nobody else had asked. The scar was the beginning of the story. This, the fire and the warmth and the man beside her, and the child upstairs and the books and the work and the life that was fully and irrevocably hers. This was where the story had come. She thought there might be one more thing she wanted to tell Homer, something she had been thinking about for a few weeks and was nearly certain of. She turned to look at him, and he looked back with the open, patient attention he always gave her, and she thought, "Yes, I want to tell him. I think James is going to be a brother," she said. Homer was very still for a moment. "You think," he said. "I think," she said. "By spring." He looked at her for a long beat, the fire reflecting in his eyes, and then he pulled her close and held her carefully and pressed his lips to her hair and stayed like that, not saying anything, because some things did not need saying. Outside, the snow continued its quiet work, erasing the roads and the distances, covering the plain in white from horizon to horizon. Inside the house on the quiet street in Caldwell, Kansas, in the winter of 1885, Opal Graves, Opal Reed, sat in the warmth of everything she had built and held it close, and the story that nobody had asked about had become, quietly and irrevocably, the best one she had ever known.